Hi genetic students, this is your ULA Unha, and today we will be reviewing how to approach pedigree problems. I made a flowchart that helps me distinguish between various pedigree types. I'll explain why I use these questions. When I first look at a pedigree, the first question I ask is, do affected individuals always have an affected parent? And by affected, I mean those individuals who have the phenotype that we are interested in. If the answer is no, we can narrow our answer choices down to a recessive trait. Then, to determine the type of recessiveness, we can further ask, can fathers pass their affected alleles to their sons? If the answer is yes, then we can determine the trait is autosomal recessive. To further check our answer, we can see that males and females are equally affected, the trait is skipped among generations, and there may be carriers of the allele who may not express a trait, as one would need 2 copies of the allele to be affected. If fathers cannot pass their affected alleles to their sons, then we can determine that the trait is X-linked recessive. To confirm our thought process, check that the affected females pass a trait to half of their sons, the daughters of an affected male are all carriers, and males cannot be carriers. Just like autosomal recessive, the trait is also skipped throughout generations. Going back to the first question we asked, do affected individuals always have an affected parent? If the answer is yes, our choices narrow down to dominant traits. Then, to determine the type of dominance, we can ask the question, can fathers pass their affected alleles to their sons? Once again. If the answer is yes, we can ask, are only males affected, and does an affected male have all affected sons? If the answer to our question is yes, we can determine that the trait is Y-linked. Another characteristic of a Y-linked pedigree is that the trait does not skip generations. If males are not the only ones affected, and they do not have all affected sons, we can see that the trait is autosomal dominant. To check our answer, we look to see that the trait never skips a generation, males and females are equally affected, and all individuals who have at least one dominant allele expresses a trait. Going back to our question of, can fathers pass their affected alleles to their sons? If the answer is no, we can further ask, can males pass their affected alleles to their daughters? If the answer is yes, the trait will be X-linked dominant. To confirm our answer, we can see that the mother passes the trait to half of all of her offspring, and affected father passes the trait to all of his daughters, and just like an autosomal dominant trait, we would see that this trait does not skip generations. If males cannot pass their affected alleles to their daughters, then we can determine the trait to be mitochondrial. Another characteristic of this type of pedigree is that even though an affected female passes the trait to all of her offspring, males cannot pass a trait onto their offspring. Now that we have reviewed the various types of pedigrees, let's look at some practice problems to help us distinguish between the various modes of inheritances. Let's look at this example. Looking at the 4 generations, we can ask, do affected individuals always have an affected parent? Looking at individuals 2-3, 3-2, and 4-7, we see that all 3 sets of the parents are not affected by the traits. As the answer to the first question we asked is no, we have narrowed our answer choices down to a recessive trait. Now we can ask our second question from the flowchart. Can fathers pass their affected alleles to their sons? Starting from individual 2-3, we see that they have 2 male offspring who are not affected. Additionally, individual 3-2 also have 2 male offspring who are not affected as well. If this trait was autosomal recessive, we would see that males and females are equally affected, which is not seen in this pedigree. Only males are affected. We can almost determine our answer as X-linked recessive, but we need to check a few more things. Let's assign X with capital R as dominant and X with lowercase r as recessive X-linked alleles. Now looking at individual 3-7, we see that she has an affected father. If the trait is truly X-linked recessive, this means that she will be a carrier of the affected allele and pass the trait on to half of her sons. Individual 2-3 would have the genotype of X with lowercase r and Y as he is affected. As we can also assume that the trait we are tracking is rare, individual 2-4 can be assumed to have a dominant genotype of X with capital R and X with capital R. Since the male offspring of the individuals 2-3 and 2-4 will receive the Y allele from their father, they must get the dominant X allele from their mother, allowing them to have the dominant phenotype and genotype. However, individual 3-7 is a female. This means that she will receive the dominant X allele from her mother and the recessive X allele from her father, making her a carrier of this trait. Each of her offspring has a 50% chance of inheriting the recessive X allele. Now, looking at affected individual 4-7, who is a child of carrier individual 3-7, we see that he is affected by the trait as he will receive the recessive X allele from his mother and the Y allele from his father. As for individual 4-6, he has received the dominant X allele from his mother and the Y allele from his father as he is not affected by the trait. Since we can also see that the trait skips among generations, males are not carriers, a female carrier passes the allele to half of her sons, we can conclude that this trait is indeed X-linked recessive. Now it's your turn. Feel free to pause the video and fill in the genotypes of each individual and identify the carriers. We can see here that the individuals with the blue dots are carrier females who have affected fathers. Additionally, females with genotypes with a dominant X with an underscore represent those who we do not know their genotypes. They can either be heterozygous carriers or homozygous dominant. We would need more information to know their genotype. Now, let's look at this example. We can ask, do affected individuals always have an affected parent? As we can see that all of the individuals who are affected by the trait do have affected parents, we can narrow our answer choices down to dominant traits. Now we can ask our second question from the flowchart. Can fathers pass their affected alleles to their sons? We see that individual 1-2 passes their affected alleles to their children. Individual 2-2 is a son, and individual 2-3 is a daughter. Individual 2-2 also passes his allele to his son, individual 3-1. Individual 3-3 also is able to pass to a daughter 4-2 and a son 4-3. Since we have answered yes to the previous question, we can ask the next question. Do affected males only pass their affected alleles to all of their sons? As we see that individual 1-2, an affected male, passes his affected allele to his son and his daughter, we see that the answer to this question is no. We also see that 3-3 passes his affected alleles to his daughter 4-2 and his son 4-3. Now, we can almost determine our answer to be autosomal dominant, but we need to check a few more things. We can assign the capital A to represent the dominant allele and lowercase a to represent the recessive allele. As this trait is dominant, this means that individual 1-1 is homozygous recessive as she is not affected. To determine whether the genotype of individual 1-2 will be homozygous dominant or heterozygous, we must use a Punnett square. Upon doing the Punnett square with the genotype capital A for individual 1-2, we can see that all of the offspring must show the dominant phenotype, which is not seen in the pedigree. This lets us know that individual 1-2 is not homozygous dominant. Checking the heterozygous phenotype for individual 1-2, we see that half of the offspring will be homozygous recessive and not show the trait, and the other half of the offspring will be heterozygous and show the trait. This is seen in the pedigree with individuals 2-2 and 2-3 being affected, while individuals 2-5 and 2-6 are not affected. As long as the individual has one dominant allele, they will express the trait. This lets us know that individual 1-2 is indeed heterozygous. This means that the affected offspring 2-2 and 2-3 will also be heterozygous, while the unaffected offspring 2-5 and 2-6 will be homozygous recessive. Furthermore, we can see that females and males are both equally affected. The trait never skips a generation. Affected individuals pass the affected allele to their offspring, and all individuals who have at least one dominant allele will express the trait. From these characteristics of this pedigree, we can conclude that the mode of inheritance for this trait is autosomal dominant. Now it's your turn. Feel free to pause the video and fill in the genotypes of each individual in this pedigree. We can see that all individuals who are affected will be heterozygous, while those who are not affected will be homozygous recessive. Now that we have gone over some of the main characteristics of the various inheritance patterns of traits, starting with a flowchart with these questions and checking the pedigrees for key identifiers is a great way to tackle these problems. I hope this was helpful and good luck with studying!